start, Randy, I'll ask you the lamest question of all time. And how did you get into racing?
Oh, wow. So you have to go all the way back to in high school. I raced go-karts all through high school. My dad and my uncle raced dirt cars back when I was a kid. And so I've been a race fan the whole time, been around it. Sat around on Sundays with my uncle and my dad and watch the cup races, whatever. And then in college, ran into some more guys, worked on some dirt late models, moved to Nashville and working in Nashville Speedway, ran into Andy Kirby and started helping him. And we had quite a bit of success over 3 years. And when he went full-time racing, that's how I got into NASCAR racing professionally, instead of just as a hobby on the side.
Cool. And where are you from initially, Randy? Like, where did you grow up?
I grew up in a little town called McMinnville, Tennessee. It's between, so if you know where Nashville, Chattanooga, and Knoxville is, they make kind of a triangle, and McMinnville is right in the center of that triangle, about an hour south of Cookeville, Tennessee, which Cookeville, Tennessee is where I went to school, Tennessee Tech. Got my degree in engineering there.
Awesome. And how'd you get your first gig as a crew chief, though, like in NASCAR?
That was in 2000, I believe, maybe 99, something like that. So in 99, I worked at Peterbilt Motors in Madison, Tennessee for like 5 years, just a line of applications that are actually an engineer there, manufacturing engineer. And so it's where I met Andy Kirby and helped him with his late model. We raced out of Nashville Speedway for years. And in 99, when he got sponsored and went full-time Busch racing, they hired me. And so I quit Peterbilt, and I've been professionally in NASCAR racing at one level or another ever since. So that's how I got into it professionally, and how I kind of got my break is just running local late model stuff, and coming up with one of those guys.
And would you say, like, back then, was the sport a lot easier to get into than it is now?
I don't know. It was different. Back then there were 60 Busch cars showing up, 70, and you had cup cars, 50, 60 cup cars. You had the truck series showing up. Harder to get into it probably would not be a good statement to say that it's probably different. Although I had an engineering degree and my background was engineering, I got into it more from my experience of working around a local late model shop. Most engineers get into the sport today out of college and more of the, approach it from more of the technical side, I feel like.
And is it like they always say it's a lot of like who you know and who knows you, and was that important when you were younger getting into the sport?
Absolutely. It's connections and people you meet and taking advantage of opportunities. And I say that in like I said, working with Andy, really good. I mean, a lot of success in the late 90s. He won championships 94, 96, 97, won the Eastern Seaboard National Regional, finished second. He won, I think it was Atlantic Seaboard at that time, championship for that division, and finished second overall that year. And then when he moved up, my relationship working with him, I moved up with him. And I've met different folks over the years that have kind of like, they'll give you the opportunity, but it's up to you to go with it from there, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Yeah. Like you really have to, they can only help you out, right? If you don't perform, then you can't really do anything, you're not going to go anywhere.
Yes. Right. And so when I got into it, the early 2000s, there were, a crew chief would get 100 resumes for one position. So you had to do something to one of the mechanics, one of the engineers, a driver, whoever. Hey, I want you to get a chance, look at this guy, he's whatever. And, that would get your resume to the top of the pile, hopefully. Whereas today it's probably not as large a pool of people trying to get into the sport.
And when you So I'll say, like, looking at Racing Reference is what I've been looking at, because they have crew chief stats, and you've already told me that they're not accurate. But it shows that you started in the Busch Series in 2001 with Brad Baker. as your driver, and it was 25 races over 2 years. And what was that like, and how'd that deal come together?
So in '99, like I said, I went with it was LAR Motorsports. I went with Andy. Basically, they hired me as a race team engineer, which back then basically meant I calculated fuel mileage and maybe gear ratios, things like that. Sponsorship problems through about the middle of the season. The team quit running full time. The owner kept a handful of us to run, and we ran a few races here and there. And then Gary Baker came in and basically bought that whole place, bought that race team out. And then I became the crew chief from that engineering role into that position. I was car chief for a while for Dennis Adcock, who runs Darlington Speedway now.
And there was not a lot of success with that team, obviously, but Brad was, I guess, was he a newer driver at the time?
He was, yes, in the Busch Series, Xfinity now, I guess, or whatever. But in the Busch, that was his rookie attempt there. He ran late models at Nashville, and that's actually where I met him the first time, was running late models at Nashville.
And then we get to 2003, which is really what we want to talk to you about, because we love the truck series on our podcast. Like, I still think the trucks have the best racing in NASCAR right now. They have the best aero package. They're just exciting at a level that is unlike Cup and Xfinity. So how'd you get the role at Bobby Hamilton Racing? And then I guess you ended up spending 4 seasons there.
So that's where it gets a little. So the racing stats, most of that's based off of the truck number. And it was actually jotting down the drivers that I worked with over the years. So 2000, in 99, 2000, Danny Rollins, a crew chief at Bobby Hamilton Racing, he and I worked together at the Busch team that I ultimately became a crew chief for a little while. He went to Bobby Hamilton Racing, and in 2002, Bobby added another team, needed employees. Again, contacts, people, Danny said, hey, give this guy a shot, and went over as the truck chief for. In 2002, Danny and I were together 5 or 6 races, I think. And then they moved Danny over to Robert Presley's truck, and then I took over Brian Rowe's truck. I think that was the 4, I believe. Danny's 18. Yeah, I believe that was the 4 truck. And so I was crew chief on that for the rest of that season. So I didn't do the first 5 or 6 races. I can't remember. Then I finished the season out with that truck.
And then in 03, so the thing that people don't know that's about Bobby Hamilton Racing is, like, Bobby Hamilton switched truck numbers every year. And
yes,
there's a rotating, it was really weird. So did they actually, change trucks, or they just slap different numbers on the side and say, now the 4 is the 18?
Different numbers.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
So he would have the same number the whole season, but he played around. It was sponsored things. His numbers were 4, 18, and 8. We did an 04. We had 4 teams at one time, and he just added the 04 number, and I had that number in, I think, 2005, which was Timothy Peters' rookie season. That one of the Twitter questions was, why did we fire Casey in 2005? We didn't fire Casey. We actually had a deal with Bailey's and Timothy Peters. But Timothy wasn't approved to run Daytona, California, and Atlanta, which were the first 3 races of that season. So Casey Atwood stepped in and ran.
Mm-hmm. And
it's actually the year. Yeah, that's the year. 2005 is the year Bobby won the Daytona race. And Casey was actually pushing Bobby to draft through on the white flag lap, and Dennis Setzer just so happened spun and hit him. We crashed, and Bobby won the race.
Because you probably would have finished 3rd in that race had that not happened. Yeah.
Had that not happened, we'd probably finished 1-2, which would have been awesome. That would have been really awesome.
And I was going to say, in 03, you were on the Dickies truck, right, with Chad Chaffin. It showed.
Yes,
and
sir.
You guys had some success. You had 9 top 10s, a couple top 5s, a pole. And then after that year, you go on a different truck, and then Chad wins a couple races and probably has his most successful season. And did they just like moving people around, or?
Yeah, and actually, so that's where the stats get a little confused there too, because we actually made a crew chief and team swap in the middle of that season. We ran in 2003. I started off with Chad Chaffin, and I moved to Bill Lester. And I'm not sure all the politics behind that, but Danny went to Chad. I went to Bill, and I can't remember who took over the 3rd truck, but I ran most of the season, all but till the last 6 races as Bill Lester's crew chief. And then I finished the last 5 or 6 races as Newt Moore's truck chief for Bobby on that championship building truck. Basically, that was a project truck where we completely redid all the chassis, and it was a big engineering change. And so Bobby wanted me over there as the truck chief to help with that project as we built that. And then 04, what that Chase Montgomery truck was, it was called BHR2. That was actually a project that Ray Montgomery started with his son driving. And basically that was, we got all of our parts and pieces from BHR, but I was running the deal across town there in Mount Juliet, Tennessee.
Okay, so I was wondering about that because there definitely seemed to be a difference in performance between that BHR2 team and the BHR team. So they were affiliated, but not like out of the same shop.
That is correct. Yes. Similar to a lot of the teams today, like Front Row Motorsports with Roush Racing.
Yeah, and those are those things I try and tell people, like with my Twitter account, is I really want to do a video at some point of all the times that teams like shared owner points, swap numbers, all these things that you don't realize that are so confusing, right?
Oh, in 2000, so I moved over to North Carolina in 2006, middle of the season, to work for Bob Jenkins in Front Row Motorsports, and he was basically a start and park team, came with Chad Chaffin at that time, and it's called start and park, but he would, qualify and make the race. And then, you get start money, which was a lot of money, near $100,000 just to make the race. And, Bob has built Front Row up from that to, I worked for him again in 2010, and David Gilliland, I was David Gilliland's crew chief, and we swapped numbers. He had the top 35 rule. And so we would qualify, make the race, get locked in the top 35, and he would take our number and give it to the guy that had money with a sponsor, where he was locked in, guaranteed to start. And David and I had to continuously just race after race after race, make it on time. And never would. We performed well enough to be able to get a locked in position, but the owner wanted to keep, because we had the better chance of making the race when not locked in. So yeah, there's that shuffling going on that people probably don't realize.
And in 2005, so you had to work with 6 different drivers in that 4 truck. You had, it was Atwood, Peters, Chris Fontaine, which a lot of people don't remember drove that truck, John Mickle, Garrett Liberty, and Aaron Crocker, all in one truck in one season.
Yes.
What was that like? Like, how do you get any consistency with so many different drivers?
So the truck series was 22 races. Basically that season, it was me and 3 other guys that all their racing experience were late models. One of the guys from Tennessee, the other 2 were friends of Timothy Peters in Virginia. And the 4 of us were like, by the end of the season, we're really close, really tight. The only real consistency we had were each other. We had the same trucks. Seats would have to go in and out. And it made it tough. And that was more of a financial situation. You're just trying to do the best you can with what you got. And all the races weren't sold for Timothy. And so Bobby just had to simply fill the void where he could at times. The Aaron Crocker thing at the end of that season was Ray basically asking Bobby to sell him a truck for a couple of races so Aaron could get a little seat time before he started his truck team the following season.
And at Homestead, you had a 5th truck, right? You had 5 trucks.
Yes. Yes.
I think that's the most trucks ever fielded by a team in a race, was 5 trucks that time.
Is that right? I didn't realize.
I believe so. I'd have to look it up again, but I'm pretty sure it's the only time anybody ever fielded 5 trucks.
I think Ultra fielded 5 trucks in 2000.
Oh, you're right. That's right. As the roadblock race or whatever. That's
Marty Houston. That's
debatable. Like, we actually did an episode of our podcast on that race. We reviewed that race, and
really,
and when Marty Houston crashes and takes Gone out, I was like, I don't think that was intentional. I think Marty Houston's just not very good.
So Marty, and I tease Marty, like I said, Marty and I are friends, and I tease him a lot about that race. He said, I really wish I was good enough to drift a truck that long, and then when I finally do catches, drive it down and hit the one truck that I need to hit. I really wish I was that good, but that's part of it. I mean, Ultra took so many trucks to give to give their guy a better chance of winning the championship, and they ultimately did. But they obviously didn't do it on purpose.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like people kind of look back at that incorrectly. The other thing I'll ask in '06, it was the same thing, right? You had a bunch of different drivers. You had like Stremme
Mm-hmm.
and Kevin Hamlin, which I think was that another one of the was Legacy not approved yet for Daytona?
Yeah, that is correct.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
figured. And then a bunch of different other drivers and just the same sort of thing again, like no consistency in terms of who you're working with.
Yeah, I left. Now that's when I left BHR in the middle of that season. Uh, Sponsor troubles, and Bobby was, he was sick with cancer, and I thought he was on the other side of it. We all thought he had beat it and was on the other side of it, and it turns out it was 6 months before he passed away. But I went through that season. Yeah, like you said, Kevin Hamlin. We finished 11th at Daytona. Scott Lagasse, David Stremme. That was an interesting weekend. Talk about building consistency. Of course, with my record of 6 drivers the season before, just having another driver for a different race was just par for the course for our guys. But that was a deal. Ganassi and Dodge had asked to let him fill the truck because he had no laps at Martinsville. Just kind of because we always go in on Thursday and we're always ahead of the trucks in practice and race on Friday.
Yeah,
Actually race.
that would be pretty commonplace back then because I think Clint Boyer ran that race too, and a bunch of Cup guys ran that race. That was a really strong rookie class that year. I remember in Cup Series, and also that year there was a lot of Dodge money, I guess, that came to BHR. So it was like a Dodge. Did you guys become the Dodge factory team after they kind of dropped Ultra?
Yes, that's exactly what happened. Yeah, that was one of the goals of the 2004 season was to get that Dodge development program.
Okay, that's what we figured because it was pretty much Dodge sponsorship on everything, right? So,
yes, yeah, Lagasse. My truck had Dodge on it. It was real pretty truck.
It did. It was that orange '04
Yes.
truck. It was nice.
Yes, yeah, I love that truck.
And then speaking of Dodge, so the one thing I really wanted to ask you about was in 2007, you're Boris Said's crew chief at Loudon. In the only time Evernham fielded a 4th car, which I totally forgot happened until I watched that race one time, and I was like, what? He was in a Cup car? That's crazy at Loudon. So tell me that story.
So you talk about connections and people, So the 2005 season, Ray basically hired Bobby or rented the truck, and so Aaron drove my truck for 2 races. And when I moved to North Carolina in 2006 with Row Motorsports, I ran into Ray a few times, and he's just one of those guys that for whatever reason, I just felt comfortable talking to him from day one. I mean, the very first time I met him at a test session with Aaron getting ready for the Phoenix race. And I just tongue-in-cheek joked with him one day in 2007. I said, hey, what does a hardworking guy have to do to come work at your organization? He said, I don't know, let me think about that. And literally the following Tuesday, he calls me and says, hey, I want you to come in and look, and I got an opportunity you might be interested in. Long story short, it was to run his R&D deal at Evernham. And part of the program that Ray had originally put together was we would build, I don't want to say illegal cars, but R&D cars. You're trying to get whatever your goal is, a geometry thing, a structure thing, a compliance thing, whatever, and build these cars and test them. And then part of that testing he wanted to do was to be able to take that car and go race it so you don't have Casey running for a championship trying some new widget in the front geometry. You could get a guy like Boris said that could come in and run the race and say, okay, we can put it through the paces, the mileage, and all that good stuff. And so that's what we did, and the program actually changed 2008, but that's what it was supposed to be. We're supposed to race 3 or 4 times a year with that 4th car.
Yeah, and I've heard stories about those R&D cars and how they purposely get entered to see what you can get away with. And I don't know if you want to release any tricks of the trade, but the most famous one is Hendrick had a car at Homestead in 03.
T-Rex. It's T-Rex, right? Are you talking about T-Rex or no?
Well, it was the 87 car. Kyle Busch was supposed to drive it, and then they withdrew it.
Oh, understood.
And apparently it was because it went through tech a bunch of times and kept failing, so they decided to withdraw it. And it was apparently never going to race. They only entered it to see if it could pass tech. And I don't know if that's true. That's just what I've heard from multiple people, but no one has confirmed it to me. So
And I will not deny that.
Yeah, so teams do totally do that. All right, cool. Good to know. And
Actually, so part of the R&D project that I was working on was getting our cars lighter. It's a COT car, so it was a completely different package for us as an industry. We had spent decades, getting the rules, working in the gray areas, parts of the rules that weren't defined, and things like that. And this COT car was a lot of that stuff was defined, and we didn't know what we could get away with and what they were actually looking at. But a lot of those shenanigans were taken out from the racetrack, exactly what you're talking about with the 87 car, because now NASCAR had implemented this program where your car had to be approved through an inspection process at the NASCAR facility before you ever got to the shop. Or before you ever got to the racetrack. So one of the things we would do would be to build cars light in areas, bars maybe missing, or maybe per rule there was a gray area, and you play in those areas to see if you can go get cars certified, what they say about it, and work with NASCAR on the rules. If there is a bar that, why does this have to be 090? Why can't it be 065 wall? Why does it have to be here? And so it was more of that type of approach with the R&D, at least the R&D projects that I was involved with.
okay, so I didn't know that about the COT era, but I will ask you, like, what was it like working in that era where half the season, because it was how many races? 20 races with the old car, 16 with the new car. Like, what was that like? Because we see, and then Toyota came into the sport at like the absolute worst time, and it was like, what was that like, that season of just that craziness?
So I was, like I said, that's when I came over with Front Row Motorsports the first time in 2006, and it was nuts because the bodies, like we would hang bodies, we had templates, but you literally had inches. There were areas that had cross measurements that were 3.5 inches was your window, to where the COT, nothing on the car, and they had the big clamshell template, was 90 thou or an eighth of an inch in some places. But the big thing we would do on the older cars when you build them is you would have templates. You would have whatever 15 templates, but they were all placed individually, one at a time. So you could, as you can imagine, you could take a car and twist it or bend it or shape it where this template would fit, this template would fit, that template would fit. But if you put a spine down it and added another dimension, it would be a completely different car and a lot tighter spec. So all of that stuff was really, really tight, and it was really difficult because it was really tight on the tolerances, and a lot of guys at that time didn't. They knew how to, but it was really difficult. It was quite an art to building a car on the old car, whereas the COT, it became more of a production piece because you didn't have the plenishing wheels, you didn't have things like that where you actually made fenders. You were given fenders and stuff from the manufacturers.
And I remember midway through '07 hearing them talk about how there was a run on Cup teams hiring Truck Series guys because the COT drove like a truck. They said it's very similar.
Mm-hmm.
And were you drawn on for a lot of your knowledge from the Truck Series to try and make that car go faster?
And so it's funny you said that. At my conversation with Ray on my interview, he literally said, I want you to build this car like you and Bobby would have built a truck. And that's exactly what I did. My group, we laid two frame rails, had the rule book out there, and we built it as light. The goal was to build as light as possible for a short track car and still be safe and still be within all the rules. But, where can we push the rules, stretch the rules, be a part of the rules, or modify the rules, or, work with NASCAR on the rules to make that car lighter, to hold more ballast, to lower the CG and improve the performance of that car. Because the car was a lot higher, the roofs were higher, and the CG was very high, like a truck. And so the roll centers being so high, the drivers had that feeling of the car rolling over, and that was a lot of it. But I hadn't heard that. That was interesting because that's exactly what Ray had asked me to do, was build that car like I would a truck.
Yeah, I just remember them talking about it, like on race day and stuff. And I remember there's a few former truck crew chiefs, like Gene Need got hired by Robbie Gordon's team and stuff like that. And I remember after a while, like they were telling, I guess somebody at NASCAR said to the team to stop saying that they drive like trucks and to try and have it be its own thing. But I look back at it as a dark time. The racing wasn't very good that year. I was like, man, it wasn't really for me, but we're all safer now and that's important. But in 08 and 09, like what were you doing like those years? Because I don't have any crew chief stats I found online, but maybe those are incorrect. So
I was at Evernham's R&D program from 07 to 09 when they not sure what all happened, merger, buyout, shutdown, whatever, when Evernham shut down and became RPM, Rich Petty Motorsports. I worked to the end of that 2009 season in R&D.
Okay, and the R&D team didn't enter any races, though, did you, during that time?
No. See, so they, like I said, they shifted. Like I said, when Ray put it together originally, that's what his intent was, that we would run 3 or 4 races a year. And that shifted and it went to more of a testing program, and we would go test at racetracks instead of actually entering races and running the races.
So maybe you can give like our listeners some insight into this. Like a lot of people that especially follow me on Twitter and stuff like that are very young, and they don't remember a time when NASCAR had testing. There is no testing now. And what was that era like? Because I've talked to a couple other crew chiefs about it who worked on testing programs for years, but what was it like back when you could test Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday every week? Like, what was it like living through that?
It was crazy. And that's why a lot of teams, to keep from killing guys, basically, I mean, you're working a lot of hours anyway. And then on top of that, you've got to go to whatever, Milwaukee to test Tuesday with everything else that you've got to do. And that's why a lot of teams went to starting an R&D team like what we had there at Evernham. And he actually had the R&D had 2 organizations. Pete Rondo ran the other one for just the plate stuff. And he did just Daytona and Talladega. And basically, so we refer to it as the R&D side and the downforce side and the speedway side. And most of what we worked on was the lightweight short track stuff, although we did some downforce stuff and body stuff and things like that for the downforce stuff.
And what was like the most obscure track you guys would go to test at?
Most obscure. We would go to some teams had gone to Disney when they had the racetrack down there. Lakeland, Florida, which is a mall now. We've been to, we would go to Kentucky a lot, Milwaukee, Rockingham. Rockingham built a track, tried to copy Martinsville as much as they could to give us a half-mile flat paperclip basically to test for Martinsville things. There's one in Virginia. It's called a motor mile, but it's only a half-mile track. We did a lot of testing up there. I'm trying to think. Nashville, the Nashville 5/8 mile, got a lot of testing. I'm not sure. They also did some what they call proving grounds, which is a 5-mile track to do a lot of aero stuff and suspension work as well.
And I've heard the road course wise, everybody used to go to VIR. Is that true?
Yes, VIR, and there's another one in South Carolina. I forgot the name of it. But yeah, a lot of road course stuff at VIR.
And going to 2010, so you're now working at Front Row. You got the crew chief thing. And before we even talk about crew chiefing at Front Row, I have to ask you what it was like for crew chiefing for the greatest NASCAR driver of all time, Kevin Conway.
So I was never Kevin Conway's crew chief.
Well, Racing Reference says that you were. So
I was not. I did not have Kevin in my car. So again, they chased the numbers, and I don't see how anybody could keep up with the numbers the way we swapped them that year. Started the season with David and run a few races with trying to think. Blaney ran a couple. Tony Raines ran a couple, and then I left toward 3/4 of the way through the season, I guess, that year. But Kevin was he was an interesting individual. Yeah. Rookie of the year that year, by the way.
Yeah, I think he was uncontested for Rookie of the Year. I'm pretty sure.
He was uncontested Rookie of the Year.
Yeah, he. I know people that he owes money, so. But in 2000, like so.
I've learned it's sometimes better just to, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. So
exactly. Yeah. So 2011 to now, like, what have you been up to? Because I don't know anything about your career in racing during that time, Randy. So what have you been doing since then?
Since 2010, 2011, January, literally 3rd or 4th, whatever the first day, work day of January 2011, I've been here at Roush. So I came on actually Stackpole Engineering in their sim group and became a race engineer, did some stuff with Trevor Bain and the Wood Brothers in 2012 and became a full-time and have been a full-time race engineer since 2013.
And race engineer. So what goes into doing that job on a race weekend?
So I joke with I don't joke. I talk to my wife about that. It's interesting how the sport's evolved. At least my career, the way my career has evolved, is I do a lot of the things today as the race engineer that I did back then as the crew chief. Back then the crew chief chose everything. Like I said, when I first 99, my first year as a race engineer, we calculated fuel mileage and rear gear ratio. I built shocks. I put springs away and did a lot of that mechanic stuff. I went over the wall, carried tires, and it did a lot of that stuff. And engineers today, we select for the most part, the springs, and we look at it and we don't practice near as much. We don't test. So we've developed tools. I say we use tools that we can make laps, simulated laps, kind of like the iRacing stuff, in the computer and see what different setup parameters change and what it does. And we have goals and notes and things that we want to see technically on the car. And we use computers for a lot of that. So, but a race engineer, like I said, we'll select spring shocks, cross weight, nose weight, geometry settings, cambers, toes, all that stuff. It's just a lot more refined to just the car. Whereas the crew chief, they're worried about the crews, the teams, how are we going to get 15 guys to Homestead and where we're going to stay and all that stuff. All I worry about is just the performance of the race car and specifically the dynamics of that race car.
I view crew chiefs now as the parking pass guys. You can hit them up for parking passes. They're great, especially if you're shooting the Sunday race and you didn't have infield parking on Saturday. Go to an Xfinity crew chief and get a parking pass.
Yeah,
that's
there you go.
Hidden secret for photographers. Do that, but I think like coming from sports cars, so like I work mostly in IMSA and seeing like the data that those guys have, throttle traces and everything else and all the craziness, and they still get to test. They'll go do 4 days at Mid Ohio and they'll run 1,000 laps. But people in that light, they view NASCAR as, oh yeah, they just like, it's not like that. But I've been in a hauler on a race weekend and seen that you guys have all the same data now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we so there's a lot of that we can't get. The data's there, but we can't get it live like you can in some of the series. And most of what we get is only engine related, throttle, brake, RPM, things with the engine. We can't get travels. We still can't get shock travels and a lot of those things that we can measure when we have a data system on the car for testing. We get a lot of the stuff, but we can't have it live. So we have to basically download the data after a practice session, qualifying session, or after the race and look and see how, how it was using the fuel during the race, but we can't see it while the race is going on.
And
yes.
Being an engineer, something I've always wanted to ask is when there was the introduction of stages into NASCAR, how did that change the idea of strategy in a race? Because we've seen it change throughout, like we need to try and be in the top 10 to get stage points, but on places like road courses and things, it's completely changed how the strategy works. And Can you speak to that at all?
Well, yeah, a little bit. It's changed it depending on what part of the field you're running, right? The top 10, it changed the way those guys, because they just run all out. There's no real saving except for maybe Richmond or Darlington. Really, I mean, now they just run as hard as they can because they know they know when they're going to get tires. They know that if it's a 90 lap segment or a 60 lap segment, whatever, and you can't make it on fuel, you've got to stop once. Okay, so you just run as hard as you can till we need fuel. We'll come in, we'll get tires and fuel. Whereas before you might try to save fuel, especially like you said, the road courses are probably the most extreme example because we can pretty much make it all the stages now. So the fuel mileage thing is kind of out the window. And I think that affects a lot. I mean, that greatly affected the strategy of those races.
Yeah, it kind of bums me out a little bit, being a road racing fan, because I used to love when they win races on fumes, but it doesn't really happen anymore.
Yeah.
But speaking of, you mentioned Darlington, so you guys are going to go back racing at Darlington, and you're going to have to come off the truck and just go. There'd be no practice, there'd be no qualifying. Are you prepared for that?
Yes. Yes. So again, we can make a lot of laps in a simulation, and that's actually happened to us. It's happened to me since I've been here at Roush. Whatever year it was, you might have to look it up. I have to think about what driver. I believe 17 Indy. We started the race. Green flag was the first lap on the racetrack for everyone because we got there and it rained the whole time. No qualifying, no practice, and we took the green flag Sunday or Monday, whenever it was. One of the first times that the guys had seen laps on the car. And I think one other time, it's happened to me a few times actually, where the first laps on the racetrack were the race. And it's a big risk. There's a lot of unknowns, but like a lot of times we'll go into practice with a plan. Okay, we're going to unload, we're going to do this, or we're going to, kind of should be on the splitter a little bit to start, until pressures build up, but you might miss a little and get on the splitter a little too much, or it's a little too high. Where this deal, if you're a little high or a little low, it's going to have to live with it and figure out a way to adjust around it later. They typically give us a competition caution on something like that. So we know we got to go 30 laps or whatever number they give us. And then we can come in and we'll have adjustment built into the car to whatever, change packer gap or put spring rubber in one of the rear springs or something like that.
Just in your time working in the sport, obviously traveling, like I travel with a race team to all the IMSA races, and that's a lot of fun. And just what are some, do you have any just ridiculous stories about, with drivers and stuff from being on the road?
Yes. I should probably not share some stories. I don't know, like what kind of story,
Well, let's start with this. So let me say, who, in the kindest way that you can say it, who was the most difficult driver to work with that you had?
Oh, wow.
Not because they were, a dick,
Right.
but because they were just they wanted things you couldn't do to the car.
Understood the car the least. Maybe if you're going at that angle, I would. I don't know. It's been interesting. I've had. You went through the list: Garrett Liberty, Timothy Peters, Aaron Crocker, Chris Fontaine, Scott Lagacy, David Streamy. All these guys that had their first races in my truck as a crew chief. That is not. It's got its own challenges, not necessarily like you said because somebody's being a jerk or anything like that, but it's tough because of John Mickle is a good example. He's from England, and he drove the truck one time, and his terminology and things that he thought about and things that he was comfortable with and used to were completely different. I've had drivers that would get out of the car and okay, we got to do this, this, and this. This is what needs to happen. This is what it's doing. To drivers that are like, I don't know, you're the crew chief or you're the engineer, you fix it. Things like that. Different frustrations. I don't know. I don't want to drop names.
Fair enough. Did you ever have a driver complain about the car and then you did nothing to it and they said it was better? Because that's my favorite. We've asked so many people and people are always like, oh yeah, all the time. We're like, hey, we changed a bunch of stuff. They're like, cool. And they're more confident, but you didn't do anything to the truck.
So I'm not that guy.
Oh, no.
That relationship is built on trust. You tell me what you think it is, and I'll tell you if I mess up, I'll let you know. If you mess up, you got to let me know so we can build and get better. I would never. I've seen guys do that, and I've seen it done, and I don't think it's a good thing to do. Period. Just for that trust issue, that trust, because that's not fair to both of you. I mean, the track can change, things can change, and you literally not touch the car. a heat cycle on tires or whatever. And so you put that driver in a bad position, even though he may have put you in a position to drive you to want to do something like that to him. I'm not that guy. I've made some changes that should have done one thing and did others, but most people will tell you that. The introduction of, so I started the sport in more of the trial and error change things. Like, you want it to turn better, you would do this list of things, to the progression of today, where just about every change you make, no matter how large or small, has some kind of dynamic impact on the entire car that we can measure, we can see through simulation tools or testing devices to know what that actually did. It's not well, we put the spring in because it always frees it up. No, you put the spring in because it lowers the dynamic cross weight. It, whatever, it does all these things. So there's a lot more knowledge on my end as far as what actually happens when you do change that spring. But again, back to what you were saying though, hard drivers, or anything like that. Like I said, I hate putting names out there just for the whole trust issues, and sometimes things get back. And like I said, the sport is.
Oh, you got to be very careful who you talk about because everybody knows everyone. So
yeah, absolutely. Like you mentioned Marty Houston a minute ago, spinning out to wreck Brendan Gaughan. It's actually a pretty good friend of mine. So
yeah, that's the thing.
You just never know.
Yeah, you never know. Like man, it's such a small world, right? Like one thing leads to another. The other thing I'll ask you is just.
So you say that. Sorry, I don't want to disrupt you.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, you say that you got 12 guys on each team, 40 teams. I mean, there's only 500 of us doing this in Cup in the world. I mean, you think about that. It is really a small. It is a small knit group, and especially now. Back, when I first got in the sport, there were twice as many owners and teams and drivers and crew members, and it gets smaller and smaller and more like a small community.
Mm-hmm. And growing up, I'll ask you. So, like, obviously, you did racing, like, and you're a fan of the sport. Do you still consider yourself a fan of the sport, even though you work in it?
Yes.
Like, do you watch the other races? Do you watch the truck races, the Xfinity races?
Absolutely. Yeah, oh yeah, same. I love watching the truck. And like you said, to your point, I love to watch the truck races. It's fun. I don't know any of the names over there anymore. I mean, a few I recognize here and there, and the trucks are so much different than they were when I was racing in trucks, but it's still, like you said, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's the aerodynamics of the truck or if it's the hunger, the fire in the belly of the drivers and the crews, but it's fun to watch.
Well, I think the one constant is Matt Crafton. You would have raced against him, and he's still there. So, reigning champion.
Yeah, Matt has been there. He was just coming in when I was getting out of the truck series, but that is true.
Mm-hmm. And it's good that you're a fan of the sport. A lot of people that I know who work in it don't really consider themselves fans anymore, and I do, man. I'll watch any racing. I love racing. I'll come home from a race weekend after 14-hour days and I'll watch racing all week. I love racing. So I can't get enough racing, man. Like I'm hungry for everyone to go back and, what have you been up to in the time you've been off? Obviously we've all been off. Like I haven't gone anywhere. I've been at home. So, what were you up to in that time? Cause you just went back, yesterday?
Actually today was my first day back here in the shop. So we've been, again, we can do things on computers and not physically have parts to touch and hold and bolt together. So we have as an industry, as a company, Roush-Fenway Racing, we have gone through every race as it was scheduled to come up, and we would prepare the car, get the build sheets together. If we were building cars, this is how we would build it. And we get up to the point of actually having a car where we can start doing some K-rig testing on and start building it, putting the car together and all the pieces and parts matching up and doing a lot of that correlation work after the car is built in sim. So we've done a lot of that, but obviously that doesn't take nearly as much time as what we were before. It's funny that iRacing, Chris Buescher started doing the iRacing stuff, and Luke Lambert and I were like, after the second race, him finishing 27th, I'm like, dude, we got to get involved and help him on that. I can't. And so we've been logging in and helping Chris with the and it helps a lot. My son does some I guess the Xbox racing, And I've helped him one time. He bugged me because I started helping Chris. So last week, of course, he doesn't start racing till like 10 o'clock at night. They ran St. Louis. He sent me a text, said, Dad, help me out, So I helped him, and just having me like do the strategy, even on the iRacing. He won the race, which was really awesome. But it kind of helped Chris too, because then he can focus on the driving stuff and we can think about the strategy. Even though it is iRacing, it still would just want to be a part of it. And that's the only racing going. So we jumped in on that and was part of that. And then just doing projects around the house,
Yeah, same. I've just been doing this because we have time. I'm like, man, let's just make podcasts, because when we go back, like if we're allowed to go back to the racetrack, the fall is going to be ridiculous in terms of our schedule with IMSA and IndyCar and stuff. We're going to be just absolutely insane. It's going to be crazy. So, take the time to enjoy, enjoy your free time you have now. So, it's been tough for everyone. It's glad to know that you've had stuff you've been doing. And you mentioned the iRacing, like the IMSA team that I work for, they're iRacing in the IMSA series every 2 weeks on Thursday night, and the engineers are logged in and calling strategy for them, just like they would in real life. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Like this is real. Like people don't get how serious this is.
Yeah, it is. It is and it isn't. So one of the things I looked at Dover, which was the race we just ran, Chris just ran it. Chris was getting a little frustrated because he usually runs well at Dover, and then he's 28th. And I looked and I'm like, okay, well, you got Joey Logano, Jimmy Johnson, you got Blaney back here with you in the St. Run. These guys are normally at the other end of the field when we really run. Jimmy Johnson will be in the top 10. He will not be in the back 10 when we go for real at Dover. But it's fun. Like you said, it gives you something to do, and it's it's the strategy part and tire fall off and things like that are things that you can think about at that place.
That's good. Now the next race is at North Wilkesboro, and did you obviously everyone loves North Wilkesboro. It's we're trying to save the speedway, everything. Did you ever test at North Wilkesboro?
No, sir. I've driven past it. My daughter's going to school at App State, so I drive up 421, which goes right past the racetrack. I've flown over it in my plane, but I've never been to the racetrack. They say it's a lot like Nashville Speedway, the 5/8 mile track. That I've got a lot of laps there, but no, I've never been there.
Yeah, I've never driven by it either. So I actually, full disclosure, I live in Canada. I live in Toronto. So we didn't grow up with racing. We had to watch it on TV. So we have very little racing. But yeah, so I'm all new. I'm trying to get to all these speedways. If I can, at an IMSA weekend, if I can get out on a Friday night and go to a local track, I'm trying to experience more of that because I didn't have it growing up, the Saturday night short track thing. So I did go to South Boston this year. That was cool. I'd never been there before, so that was a lot of fun. Yeah. Check that speedway out. So that was cool. But trying to get around and do more of that. Have been trying to get to some Pinty's races this year, the NASCAR Pinty Series. I don't know if you ever watched that, but it's insane. Mm-hmm. It's unbelievable. They got to get the cup cars on a street course. I'm telling you, it'd be awesome. They race the streets of Toronto, and it's unbelievable. So, but Randy, so go ahead.
Yeah, one last thing. You talk about Canada. There's two racing usually each of the teams, and my teammate Kyle Middleton is a Canadian.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
So, just so you know, small world.
I don't know him. I know we all know each other up here. I don't know Kyle Middleton. But,
there's 15 people who live in Canada, right? You know Kyle, right?
One city, Toronto. It's our only city. So thanks a lot, Randy, for doing this. I really appreciate it. It's kind of weird that I just asked you randomly to do this and you agreed to do it, so I appreciate that. Fortunately, James couldn't join us because he's helping his mom move, but those things take precedent over talking about racing 15 years ago, so we'll forgive him for that.
It was fascinating the approach you take too with the truck series and the guys you've never heard of. I've literally met people in the sport and it's like, oh, I've seen your face and I've heard your name, but I didn't realize that name went with that face. So.
That's why when I'm in the garage, I try and just point people out. The amount of people who never knew that David Green was an official. I'm like, that's David Green, the Busch Series driver. Really? I'm like, yeah. He's still kicking around. You got to learn the history of our sport, folks. That's the important thing. Young people got to learn the history of our sport. So
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for doing this, Randy. Really appreciate it. Best of luck when we're back in a couple weeks at Darlington. I'll watch it on TV. And if I'm back in the garage later in the year, I'll swing by and say hello. So
that sounds good, man. Appreciate it.
All right, man. Thanks
Great.
so much, and take care. Be safe.
All right, you too. Thanks. Bye.